and welcome. One that is about the fundamentals of the EU, but also about one issue that these days will decide whether the EU has a budget for the next 7 years and whether it can launch its massive and much needed recovery plan. The issue of the rule of law and how to uphold it is about the values shared by the 27 member states. It is also about confidence between them and ultimately about whether Europeans live in a society when their rights and freedoms are fully guaranteed. Different mechanisms have been established to protect the rule of law in the EU, especially the Article 7 procedure and the recent rule of law mechanism. But so far, they have failed to ensure that the highest standards are applied in all member states, and especially in the 2 member states that are subjected to this Article 7 procedure, namely Poland and Hungary, which are also the 2 countries that are blocking the EU budget right now. So what is missing in the toolbox to obtain the expected results? How can this toolbox be strengthened or reformed to become more efficient? Should, for instance, the EU integrate the existing mechanism in a single comprehensive EU mechanism? Should the rule of law mechanism incorporate all Article 2 values of the EU treaty, such as democracy or fundamental freedoms? And of course, given the current events, should EU funding be linked to the protection of Article 2 values? There is also the general context of the COVID-19 pandemic and all the restrictive measures that governments have taken so far. Does this crisis make the rule of law even more at risk in the EU? There are many questions, and to find, hopefully, many answers, we have a very relevant panel at our disposal this afternoon. First, we have Corina Rebegea. Hello, you are Director for Democratic Resilience at the Center for European Political Analysis, which is based in Washington. We have Gennady Barba. You are Head of the Rule of Law Unit at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which I think is in Warsaw. And we have Michal Šimečka. You're a member of the European Parliament from Slovakia. You sit with the S&D Group, and you are a member of the Committee on Civil Rights, Justice and Home Affairs. I think you're Renew, right? I made a mistake. Sorry. And yeah, sorry about that. And we also expected Janos Boka, who is Hungary's State Secretary for Cooperation in the European and International Justice Affairs at the Ministry of Justice. But today he was required to prepare and to participate in tonight's video conference of EU leaders, which will mention the rule of law and the budget discussion. So we will try to put into this debate the Hungarian point of view, so we have more or less the debate that was planned. So in our discussion, I will start with you, Gennady Barba. Because the OSCE is, of course, active on the rule of law. I think it was involved in the rule of law report that was published by the European Commission in September. So I would start with this question from your position, which is more general than the EU. How do you see the situation of the rule of law in Europe these days, especially with the COVID crisis? Would you say that the problem is changing in magnitude or in nature with the crisis we are getting through?
Thank you. I apologize if you hear some noises. I'll try to speak close to the microphone. I'm very pleased to participate in this discussion. It's an honor to be present at the Prague summit. Unfortunately, we cannot do it in person. And as you mentioned, Eric, indeed, I'm in Warsaw right now, where is the headquarters of our organization. So we are an organization part of OSCE, but we are an autonomous institution. So we have 57 participating states, including all EU member states, but also United States, Canada, Eastern Europe, Central Asia. So these are the member states of our organization, and we work on issues of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Now, when it comes to the European Union and rule of law matters, I have to say that the European Union is still, and it's a good example for us and for many of our states when it comes to how check and balances work and how legal certainty works or how judicial independence works. So we still have many experts from the European Union who are present and are examples in many OSCE participating states in the East, Southeast, and Central Asia. Nevertheless, we also see with concern latest developments in some countries in the European Union, and this is one of the reasons I would like to share with you more information. As you mentioned, we participated actively in development of benchmarks for the EU report. We believe it's a welcome and needed instrument to assess the observance of rule of law principles in the EU member states. Now, coming back to your question, I think what we see now, we see both changes in magnitude, but also in nature. And first of all, I have to say, maybe our other interlocutors will also mention it, I have to say the challenges we see in the rule of law are linked with the challenges which our democracy faces today. We see increased populism. We also see trust in democratic institutions is decreasing. Last year, for the first time, we saw that more than half of the global population live in autocracies. So this trend, unfortunately, has an impact also on how rule of law is implemented in our countries. Rule of law is a building block of our democracies. So I believe the solutions to these problems are also part of the solutions to how to increase the trust in democratic institutions. And I think the previous speakers in the previous panels also touched upon this. So that's one on the one hand. On the other hand, we see clearly problems related to specific rule of law principles in EU, but also outside. And first of all, this is judicial independence. Judicial independence is at the key. It's a key principle for rule of law. And OSCE states said that it has to be respected in law and in practice. Yet in 1991 in Moscow, unfortunately, the attempts of political control of the judiciary, which we see in some countries, are very sad. And this is unfortunately the negative examples which also happen outside the European Union. We all are aware of the Justice Scoreboard, which shows a tendency of decreased trust in the judiciary. And we also see the scoreboard showing that political influence is one of the major problems which people, but also businesses, see happening now in the European Union. So I think here is the key of the problems, and the ways judicial independence is undermined are several. I can briefly go through that if I have some time. So one of these avenues is control over the work of bodies who administer the judiciary, councils for the judiciary. And this is by increasing political control of members coming from political branches of power in these councils who can influence the decisions regarding appointment, promotion, or sanctioning of judges. So that's one example. Another example is disciplinary proceedings against judges and limitations of the freedom of speech. So we see again examples of political branches of power influencing disciplinary proceedings by initiating these proceedings by political actors like Minister of Justice, or by initiating disciplinary proceedings by presidents of courts who can be appointed by Minister of Justice. We see example of disciplinary proceedings being used against judges who, as part of public debate, criticize some reforms which undermine judicial independence. And this again is a very, very sad example. Another example or avenue through which influence on the independence of the judiciary is happening, in our view, is termination or early termination of mandate of judges. It's one of the key guarantees of judicial independence to have security of tenure. Nevertheless, we see different measures called reforms which undermine this and which reduce the term of office of judges. Again, it's another problem. And finally, I think what is also a challenge, but at the same time a solution, is transparency of the judiciary. As I said at the beginning, trust in public institutions is has a tendency of decreasing right now. And transparency of judiciary can help improve this trust. We believe the work of judicial councils, the work on how judges are being selected, promoted, has to be made public, has to be opened, especially in countries which have issues of corruption. I think the criteria for selection, the procedure has to be transparent and based on clearly on merit, both for judiciary in general, but especially for senior positions. So these are the main issues and questions which we see happening in Europe, but also outside. And then finally, related to COVID crisis, I think the impact of COVID on the functioning of the rule of law and of courts is visible. We saw that from the very beginning, from spring, because all year our institution was monitoring how emergency measures were being imposed in different countries. So we saw that from the beginning that there is a tendency for the executives to take more powers and to limit the role of parliaments. And what we think is needed is for the parliaments to supervise actively the governments in this. The legislation, again, there was plenty of pieces of legislation, and that created confusion. So what is needed is to have coherence and legal certainty, again, another principle of rule of law, and this was missing at the beginning. Now the situation is improving. Another issue we saw is courts, silent at the beginning, but slowly courts became more vocal on the legality of emergency measures. So some courts decided that emergency measures were not constitutional. So I think these are the major challenges. But when it comes to the functioning of courts, of course, they were directly impacted by the COVID crisis. They were not, all of them, they were not able to deliver justice to citizens. Some tried to find solutions very quickly and adopted protocols and measures which allowed to hear cases remotely or in person. But again, this was an improvisation. What is needed is a clear legal basis to regulate such situations, and also legal basis to use IT solutions in courts. And these IT solutions should be, of course, used whenever is possible, but they should not undermine the right to a fair trial. And unfortunately, in some examples, that is what we noted, that use of IT solutions precluded some defendants to examine evidence. And this was, again, another set examples from the influence of the COVID crisis. I think I will stop here, but this is the general overview which we have at the moment.
Thank you very much. We'll have the opportunity to develop all these points. Corina Rebedgea, you have the experience of rule of law and justice reform projects, especially in the Balkans, in your professional experience. Do you see common patterns between the rule of law issue in the EU and democratic challenges you have seen in the EU challenges, in the EU neighborhood, sorry? And there are, in the field of democratic resilience, potential solutions for the rule of law debate in the EU. What kind of parallel of solutions do you see in that?
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to be with you on this panel. I would start by saying that there is no democratic resilience without the rule of law. And I think we've heard that quite a bit in the previous panel, and also Gennady alluded to that in his remarks. And that's kind of the infrastructure upon which a lot of our institutions and values and norms and practices are being built. And I would say that in terms of the challenges that the EU countries are facing right now, they're not fundamentally different from the challenges that some of the countries in EU's vicinity, and you alluded to the Western Balkans, I would add Eastern Partnership countries, are also facing. And again, Gennady also talked about the trends that we've seen developing, at least in the past decade, with a global depreciation of democratic standards and rule of law, with an increase in the wave of populism and illiberalism, polarization, corruption, disinformation that contributes to all of this, the creation of this culture of the other and demonizing others, which is also part of populism. Of course, the erosion of fundamental formal institutions, from checks and balances and constitutional guarantees to judicial independence. Again, Gennady talked about this before. And all of these also kind of point to the lack of sustainability of reforms that I think is also something that has marked a number of countries, both inside and outside the EU. And all of these also, to add kind of a bigger picture challenge, invite a slew of foreign hostile actors to manipulate our systems. But I would take your question and sort of rephrase it a little bit, if I may. And I think your question is about the EU's normative power and whether the EU is still an effective norm promoter and norm enforcer, or whether the EU has lost some of that leverage. And I think that has been a debate, at least again in the past 10 years, regarding the latest rounds of EU enlargement. So the Central and Eastern European countries, Romania and Bulgaria in 2007, and then Croatia. This is a big topic because a lot of the academic literature, if you will, shows that perhaps the EU has not had the impact in socializing mainly political elites into this culture of rule of law and the culture that sort of of democratic governance that Article 2 of the treaty instills. That perhaps this was not entirely successful, and that perhaps the mechanisms in place and the set of incentives were not the right ones. And I think that this is a conversation that is sort of catching up with us today and even this week with all the developments and the discussion about the EU budget and the recovery package, because some of the actors that were somehow the poster children of the EU accession or EU integration are no longer those poster children. And I think one of the questions here is what happens with the model of integration that the EU represents, and whether this still has that seductive effect that it had for so long in the Western Balkan countries and in Eastern Partnership countries. So I think one way to look at this, and I think we are seeing some developments inside the EU, is to have a more integrated approach. And I think you alluded to that, Eric, in your introduction to the panel. There is a wide range of mechanisms that the EU has developed over the years. And I think the focus on anti-corruption, anti-fraud, and strengthening the rule of law is only going to increase just by the nature of how the different mechanisms have evolved inside the EU. And now we're seeing an increased role of the European Parliament, which I think adds the so much needed effect of sovereignty and legitimacy, popular legitimacy, acting on behalf of the European voters. So I think the challenge that we will have to face is going to be a political one. Not so much on the technical side where solutions exist, but on the political side. And again, this is the challenge we're seeing today. And the ability of the EU to deal with let's say, more insurgent countries inside its borders will have an impact on how we're dealing with on the outside. So going back to some of the solutions, I think, again, looking at a more integrated approach, I think will be useful. I think we have all of these documents and frameworks, and sometimes we get lost on how to enforce some of these. What measurements are we using? Are they an accurate measurement that would allow us to compare the countries and create benchmarks and also give clear indications to, let's say, political leaders or civil society leaders to actually do the work domestically. So that's on the one hand. Secondly, I think just admitting that that most of the issues are actually cross-border issues. And I think the EU, again, is coming to that realization. So, for instance, dealing with malign finance, corruption, money laundering, and organized crime, disinformation, of course, and the dark money that is behind it, and even the golden visas situation that, again, the Commission has begun to address now. These are not EU per se issues. They are EU and its neighbors, or EU and other actors, global actors issues. And I think that needs to play into how the EU envisages its sort of rule of law construction, but also rule of law enforcement. And I would add here, just because we are in the middle of another debate, and that's about the Magnitsky legislation, I think that's another indicator that the EU is thinking about its global role in setting norms and regulations on that. And I think, and I'll try to stop here, but I think on the issues of, like, the question you asked before on substance and magnitude, I think we are seeing the changes are substantial on both, and I think kind of the magnitude also of the problem also is a result of having ignored the substance for a number of years and not having thought about how to address it for a number of years. So to conclude, I think it depends on whether you're a glass half full or glass half empty kind of person. I think there has been a lot of progress in the EU, and I think there are a lot of encouraging signs that could be seen there, but also just a lot of very problematic developments that might lead to some of the political solutions that we have feared so much in Central and Eastern Europe. Speaking of 2-speed or 3-speed Europe, and so on. And I'll stop here, and I'm happy to elaborate on some of these later on.
Thank you, Corina. You stressed the importance of having a more integrated approach and action at EU level. So it's perfect moment to turn to Michal Šimečka, who, as an MEP for the Renew Group, you are the author of a resolution that was adopted last month at the European Parliament, calling for the establishment of an EU mechanism on democracy, the rule of law, and fundamental rights. And this mechanism would establish an annual monitoring cycle that would cover all aspects of the Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. And it would lead to country-specific recommendations with timelines and targets. So some a kind of mechanism with teeth compared to what exists now. But how do you think the mechanism that you proposed would ensure more efficiency? And is it still relevant with the COVID crisis, as we see that the situation has evolved in all member states? So what was the thinking behind your resolution, your proposal, and how do you think it would be more efficient than what we have now?
Thank you very much. I have to be at the Prague European Summit, not least because before I went to politics, I used to work as a researcher at the Institute of International Relations, which at the time, and I believe still is, one of the organizers or the instigators of the Prague European Summit. So it's definitely great to be here, unfortunately, just virtually. Now, a lot has been said about various issues affecting rule of law, democracy in Europe. When it comes to the initiative, or to the European Parliament's initiative, or to the various other efforts to strengthen rule of law, monitoring and enforcement, I think there are two key moments, or two key drivers of why there's so much effort put into this. The first one, and let's be kind of blunt here, and I'm sorry that our Hungarian colleague couldn't make it because it would make for a good discussion. But let's be honest about where we are. And the fact is that the European Union finds itself in a grave crisis of its founding values. It's not just Hungary, although to a large extent it is about Hungary and Poland, but not just about these two countries. But we have a situation in which it is uncertain whether the European Union will remain a club of liberal democracies. And some say it already isn't. And you can imagine a situation in a few years where we have a union where some member states would be, liberal democracies, full functioning with democratically elected legitimate leaders. Some would be hybrid regimes, some would be dictatorships. And this simply would be, and I strongly believe that it would be, the end of the European Union as we know it, even in practical terms, because that kind of union simply cannot function and cannot sustain its cooperation and its various policies, from the single market to Schengen to what have you, because all of those are based on trust among fellow member states and their politicians. And that trust is based on the fact that we're all, after all, Democrats who sit in the European Council or in the various Council formations. So I think this is one of the drivers that really we're in a state of crisis, and things are not getting better. Things are getting worse. I mean, we have all sorts of, as you mentioned, Eric, we as the European Union have all sorts of instruments on how to address law shortcomings in its member states. We have obviously Article 7. We have different frameworks for dialogue with member states. We have infringement proceedings. We have decisions of the European Court of Justice now. And all of these are somehow in motion, but things are actually getting worse on the ground. You don't see any progress in neither Hungary nor Poland, which are the most problematic member states. So that brings me to the conclusion, and brought us in the European Parliament to the conclusion that we need to do more, not just in terms of the existing mechanisms and the existing instruments, because some of them are clearly going nowhere, such as Article 7. We have all sorts of never-ending dialogue and hearings, but it's not going anywhere. Which is why we need to have a more effective instrument, and to integrate the various existing tools, because they are, frankly, it's quite a confusing landscape even for people who do this in the European Parliament and the Commission, not to say about citizens. And this was the idea, to integrate the various things that we have, add an annual monitoring, which is a crucial piece of this. It's much like the European semester in economics and economic policy making, where you would have an annual objective monitoring of all 27 member states based on clear benchmarks. And on that basis, on that monitoring, there would be, recommendations on how to improve the situation, and there would be clear consequences also, when it comes to enforcement, what happens if this or that is not remedied. This is something the Parliament has been calling for years, and has reiterated in the resolution that I authored, which doesn't mean to abolish the existing instruments, the budget conditionality, but to kind of put it into some order so that also citizens can orient themselves in it and can understand it. I'm very I have to say that it's good that the European Commission has also acted in the meantime and has come up with this first step, which is the rule of law report released last month, which goes in the right direction of monitoring of all 27 member states. And it's very comprehensive, it's very good. It offers sort of a map of where all the member states are, what the problems are. But what I think it lacks is follow-up and teeth. And this goes back to the debate we have, at the moment in Europe, which is the Hungarian and Polish kind of veto of the European budget. I think one of the ways to give all of this monitoring and all these rule of law instruments some real teeth is to tie it to the disbursement of money from both structural funds and the recovery package. It's unfortunate that it has come to this, and it's partly because all of the other instruments, namely dialogue, has failed to improve the situation. And well, we can just hope that kleptocrats like Mr. Orban will finally at least take this seriously, because it's about money. And it's unfortunately we have come here, but this is where we are. In some ways, I have to say though that respect for the rule of law, issues such as independence of the judiciary, as a precondition for receiving EU money, is in theory should not be controversial at all. It should be something that's kind of fairly straightforward. It should have been there from the very beginning. I frankly don't see anything why it should be controversial. There's no real. I mean, I would assume all member states want to be seen as respecting the rule of law. So I can't quite fathom why Hungary and Poland. Of course, I do understand why they're doing this, but it doesn't make any sense. It's as if they're saying that, well, they want to continue, stealing EU money and destructing rule of law and independence of the judiciary. And if we don't let them, they'll just bring down the whole European economy. This is the kind of signal that it sends, unfortunately. But this is the instrument that could, especially in this form, where it could really be used, is something that could give also the European Union the tools to enforce its basic values. And this, I will end with this. And this is one of the key problems, one of the key features of the European Union as a political body, is that it developed as a common market, as a way to bring down barriers to the four freedoms that we now know. So it regulates almost every detail of our economic life, and with good reason, to safeguard the single market. But it is very, and always has been, very vague on protecting its core values. I mean, if I take it to the extreme, I mean, the European Union regulates how our vacuum cleaners should be constructed and what kind of power they could have, but it doesn't really care about whether a member state, imprisons journalists. And this is just to take it to the extreme, but it is so that until there was no real EU instrument on monitoring and enforcing the key values of Article 2.
Thank you. Since Janusz Bokak could not be with us, I will raise some of the points of his government and the Polish government too. And since you're a parliamentarian as well, I think the Hungarian and the Polish government stress the fact that this is a politicized process, which goes against the government that don't accept the mainstream policies of the EU on migration, on gay rights, for instance. And so maybe the failure of the current mechanisms comes from the fact that it's difficult to ensure that it is a non-political process and that it is not used against governments that do not want to follow, who want to keep their own way of doing policies and having their choice in what they want to do with migration or with gay rights and so on. So what should you oppose to this kind of argument?
Well, my response would be that it's pure propaganda. It is absolutely nothing to do with the legal reality of this particular regulation that we're speaking of the conditionality. You just have to read it to see that there's nothing about migration. There's absolutely nothing about LGBTI rights. It's rather precise about what it is about, and that's rule of law, independence of judiciary. So I mean, this is one thing, that this is pure propaganda for domestic consumption in Hungary or in Poland. It's the same kind of propaganda that they, as is the fact that they're accusing the European Union of being like the Soviet Union, of punishing states. So you can see, what kind of absurdity does this come to. The fact of the matter is that that there are issues in which governments can legitimately and should disagree. We have conservative governments in the European Union. We have socialist governments. We have liberal governments, although unfortunately not as many as I would like to see. But that's one issue, and nobody's constructing a rule of law mechanism against anyone. It's a mechanism that will apply to everybody, to all member states, regardless of what political persuasion their government is, and it's supported by everybody. It's supported by the conservatives. This rule of law. It's supported by those who don't like migration or are not in favor of a more liberal migration policy. It's supported by socialists in the European Parliament. It got this particular proposal. It gets a huge majority across the political spectrum. It is supported by every member state for Hungary and Poland, and there are member states which are which which have conservative governments or which are perhaps anti-immigration as well. And it's supported also by the wide majority of European citizens, as the recent Eurobarometer has shown, including, by the way, by Hungarian and Polish citizens. So whenever there's an issue which touches upon cultural values, such as fundamental rights, of course, the European Parliament as a political body, and me as a liberal, for instance, will criticize that, and even the European Parliament may criticize that if there is a majority for that. But that's another thing as saying that this regulation, this particular piece of legislation, has absolutely nothing to do with the ideology, and also the fact that when we say that Poland undermines the independence of the judiciary and its rule of law, it's not an ideological statement. The European Court of Justice has said so. And it has nothing to do with the fact that the Polish government is conservative. It would have happened even if the Polish government was socialist or liberal. So I think we shouldn't sort of let this propaganda kind of blind us to the fact that we're talking about the very basic values which are not about ideology per se.
Thank you. The debate about, and it's raised in your proposal, is to cover all Article 2 of the treaty issues, which are not only the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. It's also about equality, democracy, respect for minorities, human dignity. I will turn to Corina now. Do you think that enlarging the scope of the action of the EU, not only on the rule of law and judiciary, but also on all these values, would be a strong instrument, or on the other hand, would be at risk of creating or enlarging the cultural war we can see already between Poland, Hungary, and the rest of the EU? How do you think that could be used? And would it be helpful to cover all these issues and not only the rule of law and judiciary?
Thank you, Eric. I don't think there is a risk of diluting the framework. On the contrary, these countries, when they became members to the EU, subscribed to all of these principles. They subscribe to the Copenhagen criteria, for instance, that include just a broad definition of democratic standards and rule of law. It wasn't just about the independence of the courts, for instance. Also, I do not think that we can separate rule of law principles from democratic principles. And for instance, as we've seen, particularly during the pandemic, in terms of ensuring mechanisms of accountability, legal mechanisms of recourse in case certain rights were limited, these all have rule of law implications. Media freedom is part of it. General freedoms and liberties are also part of it. So I think, and we've seen in the debate, and I think, Michal, you alluded to that as well, there is a tendency to kind of separate or insulate certain topics. For instance, saying that the economy or finances have nothing to do with the rule of law. This is about the economy. Well, it's not true. This strikes to the core of the European Union in ensuring that the funding and European citizen taxpayer money is actually is spent well. So I think it was a good development in the rule of law report of the Commission that they included checks and balances and the way the fundamental constitutional structures and setups are being respected, really. That they've included the ability of the media to provide scrutiny and keep governments and politicians accountable, and combine that with corruption and independent judiciary. I think these are all core pillars. And I would also add, and I'll finish here, this is not a new development. If you think about Romania and Bulgaria, for instance, that became members of the EU with an accompanying cooperation and verification mechanism, even there, I think the trend of making the concept of rule of law to be more comprehensive and include democratic governance principles there is quite visible since 2007. And if you read the reports now, you'll see that they refer to how, for instance, political power and political bodies like parliaments and governments are attempting to encroach on all these fundamental liberties. And I think, so that points to this recognition inside the EU that I think is becoming more mainstream, that rule of law is not just about an independent judiciary, and it is about a variety of principles of democratic governance, and that includes transparency, liberties, freedoms, freedom of expression, and so on. So yes, it's a good idea to base a rule of law mechanism on Article 2.
Thank you, Gennady. I think you would agree with that. I would I would like to come back to the point of the trust of the population that you raised, because maybe the paradox of the situation is that if we take the example again of Hungary and Poland, Viktor Orban has won 3 elections in a row, and this year we saw the PiS candidate in the presidential election win again after PiS winning again a majority in the Polish parliament last year. So how do you explain the fact that the trust in the institutions is maybe stronger where the rule of law is under attack? And how do you think this paradox could be reversed? And what kind of lessons do you draw for the whole of the EU, and what kind of policies should be implemented to defend the rule of law and regain at the same time the trust of the citizens?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I think the issue of rule of law, as other speakers also said, is linked with the challenges which democratic institutions face. And the paradox is that what we see, latest developments, I will not refer to countries, I would just mention in general, but this is a tendency which we see also outside the European Union, is that there is strong support for political forces who actively promote undermining the rule of law and then coming to power, adopt legislative initiatives which undermine rule of law through all those means which I mentioned earlier. And of course, the question is why that is happening. There are various reasons. We don't have a definitive answer, and I think this is exactly the right area to explore more, to understand why people support heavily such politicians. And the solution is also in this way, because the solution would be for people to support politicians who defend the rule of law, for politicians who promote democratic values. So how to reverse this? How to make people make these choices? I think we need to understand the problems which people face, and I think these problems lie in lack of integrity. In some cases, we see corruption. Corina mentioned it earlier. Lack of understanding how democratic institutions function. If we refer to the judiciary, not always we see transparency on how judges are being appointed, or how high-level positions are being filled. So that's another problem. Or lack of integrity on how political parties are being funded. Again, another problem. All this together, I think, generate lack of trust. But it's not our area of competence, but I think we need also to look a little bit deeper. There is huge distrust and huge dissatisfaction with the social inequality. There is huge dissatisfaction with poverty. And I think the governments have to look at that as well. So the solution, I think, is complex. It's not only building institutions and trust in institutions, but trying to solve the problems, underlying problems. And this is the example is very clear. Building an institution and adopting a law which is good and democratic can be easily reversed, as the examples show, in a matter of a few years. In a matter of a few years, the rule of law degrades quickly by changing the policies and by changing the legislation. So the solution is to have people support for political leaders who support and promote rule of law values. And I think that is part of the solution. But of course, we do not negate the other side, and we work on this actively, and we support other organizations who work on building trust in democratic institutions. So we promote independence of the judiciary by developing guidelines for judges, by developing guidance for politicians, how to ensure transparent selection of judges, how to strengthen the capacity of judicial councils to resist political influence. So we work on all these areas, and I think that is the other side of the solution to the existing problems.
Thank you. Maybe we can do the questions of the audience because time is running out. So, Katerzyna in Prague, do you have questions from the audience already, or shall we continue to the discussions before we have enough questions?
Thank you very much, Eric. Yes, of course, we have already questions from our audience. I'd love to thank you for this great debate and great discussion. And well, let's go to the first question from Teresa Novotná. Can you envisage any tough measures against Hungary, Poland, e.g., next gen EU outside of MFF, as in euro crisis, Fidesz out of EPP? What would be consequences for Hungary, Poland, and the European Union? Please, Michal Šimečka, I'll pass you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. If I understood the first part correctly, the question is whether there is a way out of this impasse that we're in, and constructing the next generation EU, the recovery package, just among the 25 or 24 member states, that is leaving Hungary and Poland aside, so to speak. Now, there is, I mean, technically, legally speaking, this is absolutely an option. There are actually two options of doing it. One is through an intergovernmental treaty, on the likes of the European Stability Mechanism, which, if I recall correctly, was created this way precisely because there was opposition from some member states. But there's another option which would be community-based and which would be based on enhanced cooperation. I think it's Article 236 of the Lisbon Treaty, if I'm not mistaken. But that's also another way of doing it. Now, all of this would, however, be very, very difficult. It would cost time, and it would be controversial, of course. Therefore, I think this should be sort of a last resort pathway of this. I still think or hope that by come January 1st we'll have a budget and we'll have next generation EU up and running, and there will be a way in which this could be done without or with the current arrangement. That obviously is falls onto the German presidency to help deliver that. But I still think for the time being we could still do it and without weakening the rule of law conditionality. Because I mean, whenever we speak of a possible compromise, it is absolutely clear that the regulation as it is, it has been agreed and passed by the Council already in the Coreper, and has been agreed with the Parliament. That cannot be weakened. The European Parliament has said so. Member states have said so. The Dutch Prime Minister has said that what has been agreed is already a compromise and a bare minimum of what the Netherlands would accept. So I think there's still a way out, even without the last resort of doing it, sort of bypassing Hungary and Poland. There's still some work. And the other question, whether Fidesz could be kicked out of the EPP, me being a Renew member, actually a vice chair of Renew, it is difficult for me to say what they'll do. All I can say is that obviously there's a debate and a process going on in the EPP for a long time now. But I think with what's happening today with Hungary and Poland, crossed the line. I think Fidesz has crossed the line. All of this, not just the veto, but basically the blackmail, but also the rhetoric around it, comparing the EU to the Soviet Union and that. I mean, if I were an EPP member, this would definitely be, the camel that broke the straw that broke the camel's back, although it should have been broken a long time ago.
Thank you very much for your complex answer, and we'll go to the second one, which is here. Do you see the rule of law situation in Hungary and Poland improving under current administrations? If so, do you think the current dispute over MFF can be the impetus? And I'll ask for the answer Corina Rebigia.
Thank you for this question. It's hard to predict the future, and I think we've done this in the past, and, and we were wrong. I would offer perhaps a couple of scenarios, and I would start with the positive. I think one of the effects that the EU has had in a lot of these countries has been to provide support to civil society organizations and sometimes to new parties. And if you look at, particularly in the rule of law area and good governance, watchdog organizations have always relied on the EU and what the EU had to say, the evaluations that the EU provided for these governments to find backing in their own fights inside the country. And I think there are encouraging signs both in Poland and Hungary and in other countries that civil society is getting stronger. And that ties back to the question Eric asked earlier about this sort of majoritarian dilemma. And I think it's a little more complex than that, because in both Poland and Hungary, you could claim there was not a level playing field for opposition forces, for instance, to campaign and have access to the media as the government forces had. And the races were also tied. And just the fact that you win a majority doesn't give you an absolute blank check to do everything you want. You have to provide for the minority option as well. So I could see a scenario in which perhaps in the medium to long term, in which civil society forces are able to mobilize and provide a viable political alternative. I see this happening more in Poland than in Hungary. So, if you're on the optimistic side of things, I think you can be hopeful that there will be a political change, perhaps starting with the next round of elections. And there are some encouraging signs in Hungary as well with the local elections last year. And I think a lot of local political forces are starting to make their voice heard even inside the EU. There is obviously also a negative scenario in which things will become worse, potentially become worse in Hungary from a variety of points of view, not just rule of law. I think there's a more complex, even geopolitical situation in Hungary that will have an impact on the system of alliances that Hungary is part of, including the EU here. And then if I could offer a quick third scenario that is more of a futuristic, wishful thinking scenario, that looks at the EU as becoming even more integrated in terms of rule of law, anti-corruption and anti-money laundering or anti-fraud. And so some of the recent trends, and the previous speakers talked about that, for instance, with the judicialization of some of the matters in the EU by involving the European Court of Justice in the debate, for instance, in Poland about the disciplinary chamber at the Supreme Court. What if, and then the creation of the European Public Prosecutor's Office that is going to have jurisdiction to go after corrupt officials, no matter where they come from. Can we imagine a scenario in which corrupt officials or officials that infringe these basic principles of anti-corruption and rule of law will be actually trialed or brought to justice in a different jurisdiction than their national jurisdiction? Will the EU ever reach this type of integration? And I'll stop here. That's a scenario for a future conversation, perhaps.
Thank you very much. It was very complex. Yes, it is a complicated question, and we are a little bit limited here. So let's go to another question, and this one is for Mr. Barba. What country that has OSCE mission on its soil has recently made significant improvements regarding the rule of law and democracy?
It's an interesting question. As I said, we have to compare because we work in different regions and in areas where for a long time we saw lack of progress. We see some improvements right now. We see these improvements in Central Asia, for instance. And there are some changes which help countries in Central Asia to become to have better guarantees for rule of law. And I will give the example of Uzbekistan. But again, in this discussion, I think it's important to underline that European Union is still an example for many countries outside Europe and in Eastern Europe and in Southeastern Europe, and we actively promote the values and the level of democracy and rule of law which the countries in the European Union achieved. So again, to say there is progress based on the many years of stagnation, or many years of lack of progress. But a general trend which we see in the European Union, of course, based on the latest analysis and latest surveys, is a deterioration of rule of law. That is the overall impression of what is happening right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we will continue with another question we have here from our audience. What would be the repercussions of having an autocratic regime in the EU ranks as opposed to allowing, although it cannot be forced, another EU member to leave? And I'll ask Michal Šimečka.
That's an interesting question. Well, I mean, EU member states are allowed to leave, as the British people have experienced and have seen. It reminds me of a debate that I was part of a couple of months back, where there was a U.S. academic who, when we were debating sort of democracy in Europe, and he says, like, why is it such a problem in the European Union? Why couldn't their democracies and dictatorships coexist? Like in the US, for part of its history, I mean, you had illiberal, what we would call, perhaps authoritarian regimes, racist regimes, perhaps, alongside in the same union, alongside, democratic liberal ones, and well, it worked of sorts. And so the question from the academic was, why can't this work in the European Union? As why is it just a problem that we would have a dictatorship among our ranks? And well, I think, but this is again, perhaps we'll see. Unfortunately, we might see that. But the problem with the European Union and the way it's constructed is precisely that it's not a federal structure with the kind of with the power of the center. It is absolutely based on the cooperation and trust, almost intimacy, one might say, between its member states. Every decision that the European Union does requires the Council to come up to find a majority. Most of the key decisions are, as is the budget, are still have to be unanimous. For the European Union to work in practical terms, we have to have that trust. Let us say, for the sake of argument, that we would want to integrate further in security, because obviously there are emerging threats. We've seen terror attacks. And the European Union also, and this is what everybody kind of is aware of, needs to integrate and cooperate more closely in security, in internal security as well as external security, which requires a much wider share, a closer sharing of data, of intelligence. Now, how do you do that if you don't trust the other government that it's not going to abuse it? If you have a government which is, say, a dictatorship, how would you have that cooperation if you don't trust the prosecutors, the policemen, or the investigators of one member state? How can, because you're afraid that they're going to misuse that data to imprison a journalist, or to, these are the sorts of questions which it opens up. And we already, in a way, seeing that when it comes to judiciary cooperation, because the European Union has 27 judiciaries, but they are all European judiciaries in the same way, in the way that they interpret and decide on European law. And the European Union and the single market is based on the EU being sort of a common legal space. And if you have a situation where judges and courts in one member state don't recognize the independence and therefore the legitimacy of judges in another member state, judiciary, I mean, then we have the single market falling apart. Because, and now this is a problem for Poland, of course, because there are member states, other member states, judges and judiciaries, which don't recognize the Polish justice system as being independent. And what then, if you're in Poland and you are in a court case with the government, and suddenly there are all these charges you can bring to the European Court of Justice, alleging that the Polish courts are not independent. This could really bring down the single market as we know it. So this is just a practical, example of how it is enormously difficult for the European Union to operate as anything else but a club of democracies which trust each other.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are already out of time. I would like to thank you all our guests and even our moderator for being part of the Prague European Summit 2020. Thank you very much.